Welcome to our deep dive on the Great Fire of London. We're going to be looking at historical accounts, maps, and even some wild conspiracy theories, about this event that really transformed London back in 1666.
It's more than just a fire, though. To understand it, you have to picture 17th century London, a city bursting at the seams, a major trading hub crammed within its ancient Roman walls.
So we're talking pre-industrial revolution here. What made London so vulnerable to a fire like this?
Well, imagine a city teeming with people, pollution, disease. The streets were narrow and winding. The houses were built mostly of wood, with upper floors practically touching across the alleys. It was a tinderbox just waiting for a spark.
And it wasn't like this was the first time London had dealt with a major fire, was it?
Not at all. They had a long history of fires, even a big one back in 1633. But even with those warnings, they kept building with flammable material.
Knowing that you'd think they would have had some serious firefighting methods in place, what did they use back then?
Well, each parish had its own equipment, like ladders, buckets, axes, these things called fire hooks, to pull down burning buildings. They even had a water supply system with pipes and a water tower, but it wasn't always reliable.
What about fire engines?
They existed, but they were bulky and hard to maneuver in those tight streets. Sometimes they even resorted to using controlled gunpowder explosions to create firebreak.
Gunpowder to fight fire? That sounds incredibly risky. What were the dangers involved?
It was definitely a dangerous tactic, but sometimes desperate times called for desperate measures. And as you'll see, they were about to get a whole lot more desperate. It all started in a bakery on Pudding Lane, just after midnight on Sunday, September 2nd.
This is where we hear from the diarist Samuel Pepys, who gives us a first-hand look at the unfolding chaos.
Pepys actually climbed the Tower of London that Sunday morning and recorded what he saw in his diary. He even went to the king himself, urging him to order the demolition of buildings to stop the fire's spread.
Pepys paints such a vivid picture of the panic, people fleeing with their belongings, boats overflowing with goods, the streets jammed with carts and pedestrians. The Lord Mayor at the time, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was apparently less than decisive in the face of this crisis.
Oh, he hesitated to order the demolition of neighboring buildings to create a firebreak. His reasoning: he thought most of the buildings were rented and he couldn't locate the owners. His infamous quote, "A woman might pits it out," hardly inspires confidence in his leadership.
With strong east winds fanning the flames, that indecision had disastrous consequences. The fire spread quickly, fueled by the abundance of timber in those narrow streets. By Sunday evening, it had traveled an incredible 500 meters westward. What happened on Monday?
On Monday, the fire continued its westward path, reaching the heart of London's financial district. You can imagine the panic as bankers rushed to save their gold from melting.
It's fascinating to think about how those historical events mirror modern-day financial crises. The fear, the scramble to protect assets, some things never change. What about communication? Were people able to get word out about what was happening?
Communication systems started to break down. The General Letter Office, responsible for postal service, burned down, cutting off a vital lifeline. Rumors began to spread, and with the Second Anglo-Dutch War going on, many people pointed fingers at foreigners.
This is where the conspiracy theories come in. What kinds of things were people saying?
People were convinced that the Dutch or the French were setting fires, spreading tales of fireballs and hand grenades. This fear and suspicion led to a wave of violence against immigrants.
So you have the city burning, people fleeing, and then this added layer of chaos and fear directed at innocent people. What about the city's defenses? Were there organized groups trying to fight the fire?
There were groups like the Train Bands, a kind of militia made up of London citizens, and the Coldstream Guards, a regiment of the English army. But they were often more focused on rounding up foreigners than fighting the fire itself.
It's tragic how this disaster just exacerbated existing social tensions. Were there any attempts to save important buildings?
There were efforts, but the fire's intensity was simply overwhelming. The Royal Exchange, a symbol of London's wealth and commerce, was consumed within hours, reduced to a smoking shell. Pepys and John Evelyn, another diarist of the time, both describe the overwhelming feeling of despair that gripped the city.
As Monday came to an end, the fire was still raging out of control. What happened next?
Well, Tuesday, September 4th would prove to be the most destructive day of the Great Fire. It's a day of both incredible devastation and remarkable acts of courage.
We'll have to hear all about that in part 2 of this deep dive. But before we go, I have to ask, what stood out to you so far about this story? It's amazing how one small spark could lead to such widespread destruction.
What strikes me is how the physical disaster of the fire intertwined with these social dynamics. You have this relentless fire, but then you also have fear rumors, scapegoating, adding another layer of complexity to the event.
It's a reminder that human behavior can be just as unpredictable and destructive as any natural disaster. We left off with the fire spreading westward and even jumping the river fleet. So, as Tuesday begins, what's the situation like?
Well, the Duke of York, the king's brother, had taken charge and set up a command post at Temple Bar to protect Whitehall Palace. But early Tuesday morning, driven by those relentless east winds, the fire jumped the fleet and outflanked his defenses.
So, even a natural barrier like the river couldn't stop it. What happened to the city center?
By mid-morning, the fire had reached Cheapside, a major shopping street at the time. It must have been terrifying to see this street lined with shops and homes engulfed in flames, the air thick with smoke, the sound of crackling fire.
And wasn't the fire also spreading in other directions?
Yes, to make matters worse, it began to move eastward from its origin in Pudding Lane, back towards the Tower of London.
That's where they stored all the gunpowder. What happened?
The tower was holding hundreds of tons of gunpowder. For much of the day, the tower's garrison waited for help from the Duke of York's firefighters, who were busy trying to contain the western spread of the fire.
So they were essentially left to fend for themselves.
Yes, and they decided to take a drastic step. They began blowing up houses on a large scale around the tower to create fire breaks.
That sounds incredibly risky. Did it actually work?
It did. Their efforts stopped the fire from advancing further east and saved the tower from being consumed. It was a risky gamble, but a pivotal moment in the fight against the fire.
It's hard to imagine the weight of that decision.
Yeah.
You have this iconic landmark, this symbol of power and history, and you're essentially choosing to destroy parts of it to save the rest. What about St. Paul's Cathedral? What happened there?
People thought St. Paul's was a safe haven, with its thick stone walls and open space. They even filled it with goods rescued from the fire, thinking they would be protected.
But it wasn't spared, was it?
No. At the time, St. Paul's was covered in wooden scaffolding for renovations, and that scaffolding caught fire on Tuesday night. The flames quickly spread to the rest of the structure.
So even a building made of stone wasn't safe from this fire.
That's right. Within half an hour, the lead roof was melting, and the books and papers stored in the crypt were burning. The destruction of St. Paul's was a major blow to the city, both physically and symbolically.
As Tuesday ends, the fire has reached its peak, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Did things start to improve after that?
Yes. Thankfully, by Wednesday, September 5th, the winds began to die down, and those fire breaks created by the tower garrison started to take effect. The fire was finally coming under control.
What was the scene like in the aftermath?
Pepys wrote about climbing the steeple of Barking Church to view the destroyed city, calling it the saddest sight of desolation he had ever seen. Thousands of people were homeless, and many had fled to Moorfields, a large park north of the city, setting up makeshift camps.
It's hard to fathom the scale of the displacement and the sense of loss people must have felt. Did the king do anything to help?
Yes, King Charles II was concerned about a potential uprising. Given the desperate situation, he encouraged people to leave London and offered support for them to resettle elsewhere.
So he was actively trying to disperse the population.
Yes, he also promised daily bread deliveries and set up markets outside the city to ensure people had access to food.
So even in the midst of this disaster, we see efforts to restore order, to provide aid, to help people start to rebuild their lives. But what about those conspiracy theories? Did they continue even after the fire was put out?
Unfortunately, yes. The fear and paranoia that had been brewing during the fire intensified in the aftermath. There was a widespread belief that the fire was not an accident, but a deliberate act of sabotage.
Who was being blamed this time?
The accusations against foreigners, particularly Catholics, persisted. There were rumors of a Catholic plot to destroy London, fueled by anti-Catholic sentiments that had been present for years.
So even though the fire was dying down, the social and political climate remained volatile.
That's right. There's even a panic in Moorfields when a light in the sky was mistaken for a signal of an attack by French and Dutch immigrants. Mobs attacked anyone who looked suspicious.
It seems the aftermath of the fire was almost as chaotic and dangerous as the fire itself. Were those accusations ever investigated?
A committee was formed to investigate the cause of the fire, but they never reached a definitive conclusion. While they received many testimonies alleging a Catholic conspiracy, no real evidence ever emerged.
So despite all the fear and suspicion, the true cause of the fire remained a mystery.
That's often the case with disasters of this magnitude.
Mm.
People are desperate for answers for someone to blame, but sometimes the truth is more complex and harder to find.
It makes you wonder, though, about the long-term impact of such an event on both the city and its people.
That's a great point. The Great Fire didn't just destroy buildings, it also reshaped the social and political landscape of London.
And that's what we'll explore in part 3 of our deep dive. We'll look at the rebuilding efforts, the social and political changes, and the legacy of the Great Fire on London and the world. So we've seen the devastation and the chaos of the Great Fire, but what happened next? How did London, a city reduced to ashes, rise again?
Well, the rebuilding of London is a story of ambition, practicality, and the resilience of the human spirit. Almost as soon as the smoke cleared, plans started pouring in. People saw this as a chance to create a new, improved London.
So they wanted to completely reimagine the city, start from scratch.
Some architects proposed radical ideas. John Evelyn envisioned a grand city with wide avenues radiating from Central Dome. Christopher Wren, who would later design the new St. Paul's, proposed a grid system similar to Paris.
It sounds like they were aiming for a Baroque masterpiece. Why didn't these plans come to fruition?
Well, those grand visions were incredibly expensive and would require a major restructuring of property ownership, and people were anxious to rebuild their lives and businesses, not wait for years of planning and legal battles.
So practicality won out over those ambitious visions.
In the end, yes, London was largely rebuilt on its existing medieval street plan, but they did incorporate some key improvements.
What kind of improvement?
Well, they focused on fire safety and hygiene. They widened streets to prevent the rapid spread of flames, and building codes were revised, mandating the use of brick and stone instead of timber. They also paid more attention to sanitation and waste disposal, which had been major issues in the old city.
So even though they didn't get that brand new city layout, the Great Fire forced them to rethink their approach to urban planning. It's amazing how even a tragedy like this can spark innovation.
It's a clear example of how disasters can be catalysts for change. We see the legacy of those fire safety improvements in modern urban planning today.
The rebuilding must have taken years. What was the social and economic impact during that time?
The fire had a profound impact. Thousands of people were displaced. Trade was disrupted. Many faced financial ruin. The city's commercial activity took a major hit, and economic recovery was slow and challenging.
And what about those accusations against Catholics? Did those have any lasting consequences? Sadly, yes. The accusations persisted and were used against King Charles II, who was sympathetic to Catholicism. This fueled political instability and deepened the existing religious divides within English society.
So the fire added fuel to an already tense political and religious climate.
Exactly. The impact of the Great Fire went far beyond the physical damage. It left deep scars on the social and political fabric of the country.
It's a reminder that the consequences of a disaster can ripple outward for years, even generations. Were there any positive outcomes that emerged from all of this?
One unexpected outcome was the rise of fire insurance companies.
That's interesting. How did that come about?
Well, the fire made people acutely aware of the risks, and there was a growing need to protect themselves financially. These early insurance companies actually played a role in promoting fire safety by offering lower premiums to those who took preventative measures, like using fire-resistant materials. So out of the ashes of this tragedy, a new industry was born, and one that actually encouraged safer building practices. It's incredible to think how this one event had such a lasting impact on so many different aspects of life.
It really is. The Great Fire serves as a powerful reminder that a single spark can irrevocably alter the course of history, for better or for worse.
As we wrap up this deep dive, what do you think is the most important thing for our listeners to take away from this story?
I think it highlights the remarkable resilience of the human spirit, faced with unimaginable destruction and loss. The people of London came together to rebuild their city, to adapt and innovate. The Great Fire is a story of devastation, yes, but it's also a story of hope, ingenuity, and the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome even the most daunting challenges.
It's been fascinating exploring this event with you and uncovering all its layers of complexity. From the narrow, winding streets of 17th century London to the grand visions for a new city to the social and political turmoil that followed the fire. It's clear that the Great Fire of London was much more than just a fire. It was a turning point in history, shaping the city and its people for centuries to come. And for our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Great Fire of London. We hope you found it as enlightening as we did.